The rain that soaked her slippers that night would matter far less than what she overheard behind a glass door. Lady Rena Winslow stood beneath 100 crystal candles at Ashcombe Manor, her hand pressed flat against her chest, waiting for a promise, 3 years in the making. Tonight, Frederick was finally going to announce their engagement. She smoothed the pale blue muslin of her gown, the same gown she had worn to 4 seasons already, carefully mended at the hem. Her father had left her family a name, not a fortune. What she had instead was patience, and a sapphire she'd pawned quietly last spring to pay for Frederick's sister's coming-out gowns. The orchestra swelled into a waltz. An hour passed, and Frederick was nowhere on the floor. She lifted her skirts and slipped from the crowd, moving down a corridor toward the conservatory. Its glass doors stood open a crack, moonlight spilling across the marble in a thin silver line. She heard laughter first, then his voice. "You can't possibly mean to marry her," a woman said, low and pleased with herself. Rena's spine went still. She knew that voice. Clara Pembroke, daughter of the Earl of Pembroke, and richer than the Bank of England itself. "Of course not," Frederick answered, and something cold moved through Rena's chest. "Rena is sweet enough, but her dowry is nothing. A viscount cannot run an estate on affection and an old family crest. You bring £30,000, Clara, and your father's seat in Parliament." "Then end it tonight," Clara said. "I won't have London whispering that I was your second choice." "You were never my second choice," Frederick murmured, and the sound of a kiss followed, soft in the damp conservatory air. Rena did not scream. She did not cry. Generations of breeding kept her spine straight as she pushed the door wide open. It struck the stone wall with a crack, loud enough to startle them both apart. Frederick's face drained of color. "You weren't meant to be here." "Evidently," Rena said, her voice steady, though her hands shook in the folds of her skirt. "Forgive me for interrupting the negotiation of your rescue." Clara stepped out from behind a fern, entirely without shame. "It's for the best, Miss Winslow. You were never suited to a man of Frederick's standing." Before Frederick could offer some cowardly excuse, the door opened further. Lady Beatrice Ashcombe, his mother, surveyed the scene with the calm of a woman inspecting damaged furniture. "No need for theatrics, Miss Winslow," she said. "Frederick has made a practical decision for the future of this estate. We'll compensate your family for your lost time. A small pension, perhaps." The insult landed like a slap. Rena lifted her chin. "Keep your money, Lady Ashcombe. It seems you'll need it more than I will." She turned back to Frederick, the boy she had loved since childhood. "You have my word, Lord Ashcombe. I release you from our arrangement. May your new match bring you exactly what you deserve." She walked out before he could answer. But Frederick, desperate to control what people would say before she could speak first, followed, pulling Clara by the hand. By the time Rena reached the edge of the dance floor, the orchestra had gone silent. Frederick climbed the great staircase and lifted a glass. "Friends, I have joyful news. Miss Clara Pembroke has done me the honor of accepting my hand in marriage." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Every head turned toward Rena, standing alone near the entrance. They all knew what she had been to him. To announce it in her own presence, at her own family's ball, was a public execution dressed as celebration. Whispers caught like sparks on dry kindling. Cruel little smiles turned in her direction. Frederick looked down at her from the stairs, a silent demand that she lower her head and flee in shame. Instead, Rena smoothed the front of her modest dress, met the eyes of every lord and lady in the room, and dropped a slow, deliberately mocking curtsy toward the staircase. Then, in complete silence, she turned and walked out through the double doors, unhurried, her back straight as a queen's. The cold autumn rain hit her the moment she stepped beneath the portico. The sky had opened, and a steady, bitter drizzle clung instantly to her hair and bare shoulders. "My carriage, please," she said to the footman waiting near the drive. He would not meet her eyes. "I'm sorry, Miss Winslow. Lady Ashcombe gave strict orders to the stables. Your driver was dismissed an hour ago. She said you'd be staying the night. It was the final small cruelty. Lady Beatrice had arranged it, so Rena would either beg a ride from another guest, in front of the very crowd that had just watched her humiliation, or walk 3 miles home in the dark." Rena only nodded, jaw tight. "Thank you." She stepped down onto the long gravel drive and let the darkness of the countryside swallow her. Sharp gravel cut through the thin leather of her dancing slippers. Cold rain soaked through the muslin, chilling her to the bone. Still, the physical discomfort was nothing against the burning in her chest. She had given him her youth, her loyalty, the last jewels her mother had owned, only to be discarded for a bank draft. She had walked perhaps half a mile, her breath coming in short clouds, when a low rumble began to vibrate through the soles of her ruined shoes. At first she thought it was thunder. Then came the rhythmic pounding of heavy hooves and the crack of a whip. Rena stepped to the edge of the muddy road, expecting some departing guest's carriage to rush past. Instead, a massive black carriage emerged from the fog, its silver trim catching what little moonlight there was. 4 enormous black horses pulled it, and it looked less like a gentleman's transport than a war machine. Engraved on the door in pure silver was a crest that made every aristocrat in England hold their breath. A griffin rearing on a field of onyx, the Duke of Ravenshire's carriage. Alton Blackmore was a man of terrifying wealth and influence, second only to the Crown Prince himself. They called him the Iron Duke, a man who rarely attended society events, who preferred his northern estates or the closed rooms of Parliament, known for his ruthless business instincts and his open contempt for idle gossip. The carriage did not pass her. The driver pulled the reins, and the great animals stopped, steaming and stamping, right beside her. Before the footman could jump down, the heavy door opened on its own, and a tall, broad-shouldered figure stepped straight down into the ankle-deep mud, ignoring the rain soaking his black evening coat. Alton Blackmore looked at her. His striking face was set in a mask of cold fury, but when his sharp gray eyes landed on her shivering form, that hardness softened into something far more intense. "You'll ruin your slippers, Miss Winslow," he said, his deep voice cutting through the rain. Rena, shaking now, crossed her arms over her chest. "Your Grace, I assure you, my slippers are the least of my concerns tonight. Please, return to your carriage. You're getting wet." Alton stepped closer, towering over her. Without a word of permission, he unfastened the heavy fur-lined cape from his own shoulders and wrapped it firmly around her trembling body. It carried the residual warmth of him and the rich scent of sandalwood. "I just watched Viscount Ashcombe commit social suicide," Alton said, his voice dangerously calm. "I watched him humiliate the most honorable woman in London, and then I watched that same woman walk out of a ballroom with more dignity than the king holds on his throne." Rena stared at him. "You were there. I stood in the shadows of the gallery. I heard every word." He gestured toward the open carriage door. "Get in, Rena." It was the first time he had used her given name, and there was an authority in his tone that left no room for argument. Too exhausted and cold to argue, Rena let him hand her into the carriage. He climbed in after her, rapping twice on the roof. The wheels lurched into motion. Inside, warm lamplight glowed against seats of fine burgundy leather, and a thick bearskin rug covered the floor. Rena pulled the Duke's cape tighter around her shoulders. "I appreciate your charity, Your Grace. It's a long walk to my home." "This isn't charity," Alton said flatly, pouring a glass of brandy from a crystal decanter and pressing it into her cold hands. "Drink. It will warm your blood." She took a small sip, the liquid burning pleasantly down her throat. She studied the man across from her, long legs stretched out, dark hair damp from the rain, eyes fixed on her with a quiet, unshaken intensity. "If it isn't charity, then what is it?" she asked, her voice rough. "Pity. because I won't accept pity. I may be poor and publicly abandoned tonight, but I am not broken." "I know you're not," Alton said quietly, leaning forward. "I've watched you for 3 years, Rena. I watched you sacrifice everything for a boy, playing at being a man. I respected your informal engagement because I believed you loved him. I stayed away. But tonight, Frederick Ashcombe gave up any claim on you himself." Her eyes widened. The weight of what he meant was staggering. "Your Grace, my name is Alton," he cut in smoothly. "And starting tomorrow, I am going to take apart Frederick Ashcombe's life, piece by piece. I will buy up every debt tied to his estate. I will ruin the Earl of Pembroke's standing. By the end of the season, the Ashcombe name will mean nothing at all." He reached over and covered her hand gently, where it rested on the glass. "But before I burn his world down," he said, his voice dropping low, "I intend to make you my Duchess, if you'll have me." Silence filled the carriage, broken only by rain drumming on the roof and the steady clatter of hooves on stone. Rena stared at him, her mind struggling to take in the size of what he'd just said. "You can't be serious, Alton." His given name felt strange and thrilling on her tongue. "Marry me? I'm a ruined woman in the eyes of society as of tonight." "Society's eyes are famously nearsighted," Alton answered, his voice carrying a quiet certainty. "They see an abandoned woman. I see a woman whose loyalty was wasted on a coward. I don't make impulsive decisions, Rena. I've managed vast estates, sat through years of Parliament's endless maneuvering, and built my family's fortune by noticing what other men overlook. You are a woman of remarkable strength, grace, and intelligence. You will be my Duchess, and together we will watch the Ashcombes fall apart." Rena looked down at her hands, still trembling slightly, though no longer from cold. The burning humiliation from the ballroom was slowly being replaced by something sharper, something close to vindication. She lifted her chin, meeting his gray eyes. "I will not be a pawn in your revenge, Your Grace." "I wouldn't expect anything less from you," Alton said, and his mouth curved into a rare, breathtaking smile. It was a predatory expression, though entirely without malice toward her. "If I'm to marry you, it must be as partners." "I would want nothing less," he said. "We will be the most formidable partnership England has ever seen." News of the Duke of Ravenshire's sudden marriage to Lady Rena Winslow struck London society like a physical blow. The engagement was not simply announced, it was displayed. A special license was secured from the Archbishop of Canterbury, and within a fortnight they were married in a ceremony of breathtaking scale at St. George's. Society that had rushed to cast Rena aside now scrambled backward in confusion. She was no longer the discarded, penniless fiancée of a minor viscount. She was Her Grace, Duchess of Ravenshire, wife to one of the most powerful men in the British Empire. Those who had smirked at her exit from the Ashcombe ballroom now sent lavish wedding gifts, praying the Iron Duke had a short memory. He did not. Alton's promise to dismantle Frederick's life was no romantic exaggeration. It was a siege, carried out with precision through the hard economic and political realities of the era. The Ashcombe fortune was largely an illusion, built on heavily mortgaged land and agricultural credit. Frederick had counted on Clara Pembroke's promised £30,000 to satisfy his creditors. But Alton Blackmore's fortune eclipsed the Pembrokes entirely, and he wielded it with surgical precision. Working quietly through his private brokers at Coutts, the exclusive banking house favored by the aristocracy, Alton began buying up every note and every debt tied to the Ashcombe estate. Creditors who had once granted Frederick generous extensions were suddenly pressured by anonymous financial interests to demand immediate repayment. At the same time, Alton turned his attention to the Earl of Pembroke, Clara's arrogant father. The Earl's political influence rested on lucrative but highly speculative investments in East India shipping. Through his vast network in the House of Lords, and quiet conversations with powerful men like Lord Castlemore, Alton let rumors of the Earl's coming insolvency spread. He redirected key shipping contracts, quietly diverting trade routes away from the Earl's private docks. Within 2 months, Pembroke's stock collapsed. Panic rippled outward. Facing ruin, the Earl informed Frederick that Clara's dowry would need to be indefinitely postponed and severely reduced. "What do you mean reduced?" Frederick shouted in the drawing room of his mother's London townhouse, slamming his fist on the mahogany table. Clara stood near the fireplace, her face pinched with fury. "My father's investments have suffered a temporary setback. You should be grateful I'm still willing to marry you at all, given the creditors at your door." "Those creditors were supposed to be paid with your dowry," Frederick snapped, his composure entirely gone. "Do you know who holds my debts now? The bank told me yesterday. It's Ravenshire. The Duke of Ravenshire owns everything from the roof over my head to the horses in my stables." Lady Beatrice sank into a chair, pressing a handkerchief to her forehead. "We are ruined. He is punishing us for that Winslow girl. We should have paid her quietly. We never should have humiliated her so publicly. It's too late for that now," Frederick hissed, pouring himself a heavy measure of gin with shaking hands. "Ravenshire wants full repayment by the end of the month. If I can't pay, he'll seize the manor. I'll be thrown into debtor's prison." The strain broke whatever fragile affection had existed between Frederick and Clara. The wealthy heiress, realizing she was about to tie herself to a sinking ship, began finding excuses to avoid his company. Their grand society wedding was postponed, again and again. The very foundation of their arrangement, built on greed and status, was rotting beneath their feet. Revenge, when orchestrated by a master, does not tap its victim gently on the shoulder. It kicks the door down. 3 months after that fateful rainy night, the Duke and Duchess of Ravenshire hosted their first ball of the season at Ravenshire House, a palatial residence overlooking the park. The guest list was the most exclusive of the decade. Invitations were fiercely coveted, and those left off them understood exactly what it meant for their standing. Frederick Ashcombe, desperate, deep in debt, and teetering on the edge of ruin, received no invitation. But driven by a panicked need to beg the Duke in person, he bribed a footman and slipped in through the servants' corridor. And when Frederick finally stepped into the grand ballroom, he stopped cold, the breath knocked clean out of his chest. At the top of the marble staircase stood Rena, wearing a gown of deep midnight blue, and around her throat, catching every candle's light, hung the legendary Winslow sapphire, the very sapphire she had once pawned to pay for his sister's gowns. Frederick knew that stone. He had watched Rena quietly hand it over the counter of a discreet pawnbroker's shop in a poor corner of London to pay for his sister's coming-out dresses. The realization that Alton had tracked down his own wife's lost family jewel and bought it back for her hit him like a physical blow. It was proof of a devotion and a power he could never have matched. Rena was no longer the quiet, patient girl who had waited in the shadows for scraps of his attention. She stood radiant with certainty, laughing softly at something her husband murmured near her ear. Alton stood beside her, one hand resting low and possessive against her back, watching his wife, with a look bordering on reverence. It made Frederick physically ill with regret. Gathering the last scraps of his courage, Frederick pushed through the crowd of aristocrats and reached the bottom of the staircase. "Rena," he called, his voice cracking. "Your Grace, please." The music didn't stop, but the crowd nearest him fell into a dead silence. Rena turned her gaze down slowly. Her expression held no anger, no bitterness, only a terrifying indifference. "Lord Ashcombe," she said, her voice carrying the cool authority of a woman entirely in her element. "I don't believe I recall your name on the guest list." "I had to see you," Frederick begged, ignoring the scandalized whispers breaking out around him. He looked wretched, his coat rumpled, dark circles beneath his eyes from weeks without sleep. You have to speak to your husband. You have to ask him to stop. He's taking the manor. He's destroying my family. Rena, please, for the sake of what we once shared, show some mercy. Alton took a half step forward, his jaw set in a hard line, but Rena laid a gentle, restraining hand on his arm. She descended the stairs, looking down at the man who had once shattered her heart in public for a dowry that no longer even existed. What we shared, Lord Ashcombe, was an illusion, held together entirely by my foolishness and your greed, Rena said, her words ringing out like cold bells across the silent room. I was a fool, Frederick pleaded, real tears of panic rising in his eyes. Clara broke the engagement. Her father is ruined. I have nothing left. If you don't stop your husband, I'll have nothing at all. You measured my worth on a bank ledger, Rena replied, her voice dropping to a final, icy whisper. It's only fair that your own worth be measured by the same terms. You made a business transaction that night in the conservatory. Frederick, now you must pay the bill. She didn't wait for an answer. She turned her back on him and offered her hand to Alton. The Duke of Ravenshire kissed his wife's knuckles, his eyes burning with fierce pride, before turning a cold, final look on Frederick. My steward will call at your estate Tuesday morning to collect the keys, Alton announced, his voice pitched to carry to everyone nearby. Ashcombe, I suggest you start packing. As footmen firmly escorted a weeping, broken Frederick out through the great doors of Ravenshire House, the orchestra struck up a triumphant waltz. Alton swept Rena onto the dance floor. The room watched in open admiration, fully aware they were witnessing the birth of a new and formidable era. The man who had chased her down a muddy road in the rain had not simply rescued her. He had given her the empire she had always deserved, and the Viscount, who had thrown away a diamond to chase a shining pebble, was left standing in the cold, unforgiving streets of London, entirely alone and entirely forgotten.